They had been taught that capture meant shame, worse than death. But when the American soldiers placed warm blankets around their trembling shoulders, the Japanese women began to cry. When the Emperor's voice crackled over the radios on August 15, 1945, the world that had raised them collapsed in a single, trembling sentence. For the first time in history, a Japanese ruler spoke to his people directly. His words distant, formal, and unthinkable. "Endure the unendurable," he said. But for the women scattered across the Pacific, nurses, typists, field clerks, and signal operators, the meaning was simpler. Japan had lost, and they were supposed to die. In the jungles of the Philippines, in caves on Saipan, in makeshift hospitals on New Guinea, they listened in silence to the faint, distorted broadcast. Some wept. Others simply turned off the radio and bowed their heads. The war that had consumed their youth was over, but no one had told them what surrender looked like for a woman. Their training manuals had not prepared them for this. They had memorized field dressings and evacuation codes, not the etiquette of defeat. Officers told them capture meant dishonor worse than death. Leaflets distributed in 1944 had warned that the Americans would mutilate, enslave, and humiliate any woman they found. "If the enemy comes," one order read, "you will die as a daughter of Japan." Many carried grenades or cyanide capsules for that reason. To live under the enemy was treason to the Emperor and to themselves. When American troops began to appear on the hills, the women hid. They dug into caves, covered themselves in dirt, and clutched each other in the dark. The sound of English voices echoed like the growl of an approaching storm. Some whispered prayers to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Others whispered names of brothers who would never return. In one collapsed bunker near Manila, 6 nurses burned their medical records before sunrise. One of them, Lieutenant Keiko Arima, wrote a single sentence in her notebook before tearing it to pieces. "We were told the enemy will not forgive us." By the end of the month, the Americans found them, thin, barefoot, their faces blank from hunger and exhaustion. The soldiers shouted commands they could not understand, raised their rifles, and waited for resistance. But the women did not fight. They did not kneel either. They simply stood, waiting for the shot that never came. Instead, one of the Americans lowered his weapon and gestured for water. Another opened a canteen, pouring it carefully into cupped hands. The women flinched, expecting pain. But no blow came, no insult, no punishment. For the first time, they saw the enemy's eyes not through the scope of a rifle, but as men, tired, dusty, and strangely gentle. The war was over. The empire had fallen. And in the silence that followed, the women began to realize that surviving might demand more courage than dying ever had. They came crawling out of the jungle like ghosts who had forgotten they were still alive. For weeks after Japan's surrender, the mountains and caves of the Pacific Islands hid not soldiers, but the remnants of an army that no longer existed. Among them were women, nurses, clerks, and communication aides who had followed the imperial army into every theater of war. They emerged one by one, gaunt and trembling, not because they believed they would be spared, but because their bodies could no longer obey the command to die. In the Philippines, an American patrol moving through the outskirts of Luzon saw movement among the trees. At first, they thought it was a trap. Snipers, perhaps, or stragglers planning an ambush. When they raised their rifles, a small figure stepped into view, hands shaking, a torn white armband marking her as a medic. Behind her came 2 more, their uniforms shredded, their hair matted with sweat and dirt. They carried no weapons, only a single medical satchel. The Americans hesitated. These were the same women they had been told would fight to the death. Instead, they stood there swaying, eyes hollow, waiting for bullets. "Hold fire," the sergeant said quietly. One of the soldiers took a step forward, unbuckled his canteen, and offered it to the first woman. She didn't move. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then she reached out with both hands and drank. Water poured down her chin, soaking her torn collar. When she looked up again, her face was streaked with tears. Similar scenes repeated across the Pacific. On Okinawa, a squad found 3 women hiding in a burnt-out farmhouse, too weak to stand. They clutched empty rifles like talismans, knowing the weapons were useless but unwilling to let go of the only symbols of purpose they had left. As Americans approached, they tried to bow, to apologize, to die with some semblance of dignity. The Americans did not understand the words, only the fear. They lowered their guns. One tossed a blanket over the nearest woman's shoulders. She broke down, sobbing, not from relief, but from shame. To Americans, these captures were routine. For the women, they were the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe about honor, the emperor, and the nature of mercy. They had prepared for death and instead found kindness in the enemy's hands. It was unbearable. Some cried silently into their sleeves, others simply stared at the ground, unable to speak, because the realization that they would live was more terrifying than the certainty of dying. The first American medics who found them did not understand what they were seeing. The women were skeletal, wrapped in rags that had once been uniforms, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. They flinched from every movement, every voice. When the soldiers approached with canteens and medical kits, the women pressed their faces to the ground, waiting for the inevitable strike. None came. The medics had seen the aftermath of Japanese fanaticism, mass suicides on Saipan, civilians leaping from cliffs, soldiers charging tanks with bayonets. But these were different. They were young, some barely 20, their hands trembling too much to hold the dog tags they still wore. When one collapsed from fever, the Americans instinctively lifted her onto a stretcher. The others screamed, thinking it was the beginning of torture. It took hours for the truth to reach them through gestures and tone. The war was over, and no one would hurt them. They were taken to a makeshift triage tent where field lamps buzzed against the dark. The smell of disinfectant and boiled canvas filled the air. A medic knelt beside one of the women and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She resisted at first, eyes wide, lips parted in terror. But as warmth settled around her, something broke. She began to shake violently, then weep uncontrollably, loud, raw sobs that startled even the Americans. Within moments, others joined her, a dozen women crying not from pain, but from the shock of gentleness. Later, troopers tried to explain it in their reports. They cried when given blankets and soup, one wrote, as if the gesture were impossible. Another medic admitted he'd felt ashamed by the depth of their fear. We were the monsters in their stories, he said. Then we gave them food and they looked at us like ghosts. The women could not comprehend what was happening. They had imagined death as redemption, capture as desecration. Now the enemy was feeding them, wrapping them in warmth, speaking softly. They ate the soup slowly, as if it might vanish if they finished it too quickly. When one of them tried to return the empty tin, the medic smiled and told her to keep it. That simple kindness undid them all over again. For Americans, it was routine. For women, it was the undoing of a lifetime of indoctrination. They had been taught to fear barbarity. Instead, they met restraint, and that, in its quietness, was far more devastating than cruelty could ever have been. The first nights in the field hospitals were the hardest. The Japanese women lay on stretchers beside wounded Americans, the same men their country had sworn to annihilate. The air smelled of iodine and sweat, blood and disinfectant. Canvas walls trembled under the wind, and somewhere outside, a generator coughed and hummed. Every sound made the women flinch. They did not understand why the enemy would bring them here, much less tend to their wounds. American doctors moved briskly between cots, checking pulses, cleaning cuts, measuring fevers. They spoke little, their English meaningless to the women, but their hands were practiced and calm. When a medic held a lantern close to inspect one woman's face, she turned away, certain he meant to strike her. Instead, he dabbed at an infected scratch with antiseptic. She hissed in pain and surprise. "Easy," he murmured, though she could not understand the word. His tone, steady and unhurried, was its own language. For the first few days, many women refused food. They had been told the Americans poisoned prisoners to save bullets. They turned their heads from the bowls of rice and broth placed on tin trays, even as their stomachs twisted with hunger. One nurse whispered to another that kindness was a ruse, the true cruelty would come after dark. But the guards never shouted, and no harm followed. When they finally dared to eat, the taste of real food, the salt, the warmth, was unbearable. One woman took a bite, covered her face and began to cry. The others soon followed. The medics didn't understand the reason for the sudden weeping. They thought it was the fever or the shock, but it was something else entirely. The food was proof that everything they had been told about the enemy had been a lie. The American doctors treated them like patients, not prisoners. Bandages were changed twice a day. Injections were given with care. When one of the women fainted, a nurse stayed by her side until she woke. There was no hatred in the camp, only efficiency, and that made the mercy even harder to bear. At night, the women whispered in disbelief. "Why are they helping us?" one asked. No one answered. There was no explanation that fit the world they had come from. They had lived for an empire that demanded death and found themselves spared by men who owed them nothing. That realization hurt more than any wound the war had left. They had grown up in classrooms where maps of the world were painted in red, the imperial flag stretching across oceans. Teachers spoke of purity, loyalty, and death as the highest duty. Girls were taught to bow before the portrait of the emperor, to speak his name with trembling reverence. They memorized slogans like prayers, "Better to die than to surrender, better ashes than shame." It was not philosophy, it was survival. By the time the women reached the front lines as nurses or clerks, that belief had hardened into instinct. When the bombs fell, they thought of duty. When comrades died, they thought of honor. When capture came, they thought of death. They had been told that the Americans were demons who mutilated and violated women. To fall into their hands meant eternal disgrace, not just for themselves, but for their families. And then came the camps. Quiet, organized, and maddeningly humane. No screams, no beatings, no humiliation. Just guards who followed rules, doctors who kept records, and officers who spoke politely through translators. The shock was not immediate. It grew slowly, like a fever that didn't burn, but chilled. Every routine, every act of civility peeled away another layer of the illusion they had been raised on. They tried to keep their faith in the empire. In the barracks at night, they recited fragments of the imperial rescript, whispered promises to die if given the chance. But the longer they lived among the enemy, the more those words began to sound hollow. When a guard helped a feverish girl to the infirmary, instead of letting her fall, no explanation fit. When a nurse offered a clean uniform without a sneer, it broke something inside them. One evening, during an inspection, a translator told them they would soon be transferred to a more permanent facility. The women bowed automatically. "Thank you," one said in broken English. The words came out before she could stop them, and afterwards she wept, clutching her blanket as though she had committed a sin. Gratitude felt like betrayal. The collapse of faith did not come with shouting or revelation. It came in silence, in meals served on time, in clean water, in the steady predictability of men they had been taught were monsters. The Americans never tried to convert them, but every act of decency was a quiet sermon. It told them that mercy existed outside the emperor's shadow, that kindness was not weakness, and that everything they had believed was wrong. They began to dream of home, not with pride, but with fear. What would Japan do now? Women who had surrendered, who had lived among the enemy, who had felt the strange humiliation of being treated humanely. For the first time, they did not know which side of the war had truly broken them. The camps were nothing like the prisons they had imagined. The barbed wire was there, yes, but it was orderly, almost sterile, more a boundary than a threat. Each morning began with the sound of boots on gravel, not in menace, but in routine. The Americans moved through their duties with mechanical calm, handing out rations, checking rosters, keeping records with the same discipline they had used to fight the war. To the Japanese women who had prepared themselves for execution, that calm felt unreal, like waking into someone else's dream. At the temporary camp near Manila, the first group of captured nurses were processed within a week. American clerks, most of whom could not pronounce, wrote down their names phonetically. The women bowed out of habit, but the guards only nodded in return. They were issued soap, toothbrushes, and clean khaki clothing marked PW. The first time they saw the steaming water tanks for bathing, they froze. In the jungle, they had washed in muddy streams under gunfire. Now the enemy was offering them privacy and warmth. The same order repeated itself in Okinawa and Guam. Huts of wood and canvas, medical tents, rows of cots, and food distributed 3 times a day. Rice, vegetables, even meat. There were no insults, no mockery. The guards did not leer or laugh. They spoke to one another in clipped American accents, sometimes humming tunes the prisoners did not recognize. The women ate in silence, terrified to finish their meals, expecting the kindness to turn into punishment. It never did. The cultural dissonance was unbearable. In the imperial army, compassion was weakness, and cleanliness was a privilege reserved for the loyal. Here, it was a procedure. An American nurse disinfected a wound on a Japanese prisoner's hand, then smiled faintly and said something kind the woman couldn't understand. It was not a pity. It was a habit. That, more than anything, broke them. The enemy's mercy wasn't special or earned. It was routine. At night, the women whispered among themselves, trying to explain it. Some said it was a trick, a way to humiliate them later. Others said the Americans had no sense of honor, that they could afford kindness only because victory had made them indifferent. But when the lights went out, and the guards made their rounds quietly without shouting, the silence itself became unbearable. The women lay awake under clean blankets, unable to sleep. They had prepared to die for the emperor. Instead, strangers who followed rules written in a language they couldn't read were keeping them alive. Each new sunrise felt like another reminder that the world they had known of glory, sacrifice, and obedience had already died, and they were being forced to live in its aftermath. When the Americans finally allowed them to write home, the women stared at the blank sheets of paper for hours, unable to move their hands. The pencils trembled between their fingers. The simple act of putting words on the paper felt dangerous, almost blasphemous. To admit they were alive was to confess the one thing they had been trained never to do: surrender. The guards handed out envelopes and ink as though it were an ordinary privilege, but to the women it felt like exposure. They were told the letters would be inspected, translated, and sent through the Red Cross. Every sentence would pass through foreign eyes before reaching Japan. What could they possibly say? That the enemy had fed them, that they slept safely under the protection of men they had once sworn to die resisting? Some wrote nothing at all, quietly folding the blank paper and returning it. Others filled their pages with the careful neutrality of the defeated. "I'm safe," they wrote. "I'm healthy. The weather is warm." A few dared to add, "The enemy is not cruel." It was true, but dangerous. Even as they wrote it, they could already hear the silence it would meet at home. In Japan, survivors of captivity were viewed with suspicion. Families often received notice that their daughters had been lost honorably, and to be found alive after such a declaration brought shame rather than joy. Death was loyalty. Survival was stain. The women knew it. Some tore their letters before the censors could take them. Others slipped small confessions between the lines, hoping someone might understand. I was cared for. I was not harmed. Do not hate me for living. When replies finally came, months later, they were sparse and formal. We are glad you're alive. Please return when you can. No mention of pride. No warmth. Between the careful sentences lay the weight of what could not be said, that their families would have rather mourned them than welcomed them as survivors of capture. A few women never opened their responses at all. They kept the envelopes folded in their pockets, unopened reminders of the country that had turned its back on them. At night, under the quiet hum of the American camps, they reread their own words over and over, tracing the foreign stamps and censor marks. Their handwriting looked strange, like it belonged to someone else. They had survived hunger, fear, and the collapse of an empire, but nothing felt heavier than surviving shame. By spring 1946, the sea was calm again. The same ocean that had once carried warships and death now bore the quiet procession of repatriation vessels, gray silhouettes moving slowly toward a homeland that no longer felt like home. On the decks stood women who had been nurses, clerks, signal operators, once proud subjects of an empire that had promised eternal victory. Now they were returning as survivors of defeat. They wore American-issue coats, clean and mended. Their faces were fuller, their hair washed, their eyes hollow with a strange kind of clarity. They had been fed, sheltered, and protected, and that, somehow, was their greatest shame. When they first saw the coast of Japan, many did not recognize it. The familiar ports, Yokohama, Sasebo, Kobe, were shadows of themselves, reduced to twisted metal and scorched concrete. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and salt. No one greeted them. There were no bands, no families waving from the docks, no banners celebrating their return. They stepped off the ships in silence, escorted by American officers and Japanese interpreters who avoided their eyes. They were processed in neat lines, names recorded, medical checks performed, documents signed. The efficiency was clinical, but the atmosphere felt heavier than any battlefield. They were alive when many were not. That alone made them suspicious. Japanese officials, stiff in faded uniforms, asked questions with polite detachment. Were you harmed? Were you interrogated? Did you cooperate with the enemy? The women answered truthfully that the Americans had not hurt them, that they had been treated with a kind of respect they could not explain. But every honest word deepened the discomfort in the room. One officer stopped writing mid-sentence, his jaw tightening. "It is best," he said finally, "not to speak too much of these things." Some women tried to tell their stories anyway. They spoke of field hospitals and blankets, of mercy where they had expected cruelty. Their words were met with silence, or worse, cold smiles. Japan, broken and humiliated, was not ready to hear that its former enemy had shown compassion. The official narrative of the war, of honor, of noble suffering, had no place for women who had lived because of kindness. To admit such things would mean confronting the lies that had sent millions to die. At home, families received them awkwardly. Mothers wept with relief, but avoided their daughters' eyes. Fathers spoke of duty and perseverance, pretending not to notice the foreign clothes their daughters wore. Neighbors whispered that these women had been touched by the enemy, and that their survival carried the scent of disgrace. The women learned to speak carefully, to describe their captivity in vague terms. It was difficult. We endured. The Americans were strict. They left out the details that haunted them most. The warm meals, the clean water, the quiet decency. In private, they mourned not just what they had lost, but what they had learned. The war had taken their brothers, their homes, their youth, but the peace had taken their certainty. The empire had fallen, and with it the stories that once gave meaning to sacrifice. What they brought back from captivity was not pride, not even grief, but something harder to bear, the knowledge that the enemy they had been taught to fear had treated them as human beings. That truth was too heavy for post-war Japan, too dangerous to speak aloud. So they folded it away like a secret letter and went on with their lives, wives, mothers, widows of a nation rebuilt in silence. But sometimes, late at night, they would still hear the creak of the ship's deck beneath their feet, the hum of engines carrying them toward a country that no longer knew them. They had survived the war, but they would never again belong to the world that created it. Years after the war ended, when Japan had become quiet again and the ruins had been replaced by glass towers and electric lights, a few of the women who had survived captivity began to speak. It was not an act of defiance or confession. It was closer to release, a slow unburdening that came only when they were certain no one was listening closely enough to judge. What they remembered most were not the sounds of bombs or the faces of the dying or even the moment of surrender. They remembered warmth. It was the weight of the blanket first, coarse and heavy, smelling faintly of canvas and antiseptic. Then steam the soup in a dented tin cup. Then the strange steadiness of the American medic's voice as he told them, in words they barely understood, "You're safe now." That sentence had stayed with them for decades, echoing in their memories with the same sharpness as the air that night. They did not cry from joy. They cried because safety had never been part of their world before. Safety, for them, had always been the luxury of the conqueror, never the captive. In every interview that followed, their voices carried the same fracture between disbelief and guilt. They could still feel the moment when fear had dissolved into something more painful than fear itself. Confusion. It was mercy they could not reconcile with loyalty. They had been taught all their lives that mercy from the enemy did not exist, that to be spared by him was to live in disgrace, and yet they had lived. One former nurse, her hair white as she spoke, recalled the first night she slept without clutching her uniform to her chest. "I kept waiting to be dragged out," she said softly. "But all I heard was silence. The Americans outside were talking about baseball. Baseball. I realized the war had ended for them before it ended for us." Another woman described how she had stared at the American medic's hands rough from labor, veins raised beneath pale skin, as he cleaned a wound on her arm. She had not been touched gently in years. "When he finished, I bowed," she said. "He didn't understand. He told me not to worry. I cried because I didn't know what else to do." Their tears, they explained, were not gratitude. Gratitude required understanding, and they could not understand mercy without betraying everything they had believed in. Gratitude belonged to the weak, to those who accepted defeat fully. They had not chosen to be kind to themselves yet. What they felt instead was the unbearable realization that their enemy had possessed something their own country had lost, humanity untouched by rage. The kindness of their captors had become a burden heavier than any chain. They carried it in silence through the years that followed, never speaking of it even to their families. When the war was discussed, they nodded along with others who spoke of honor, tragedy, and national pride. But deep inside, they knew that the greatest wound was not inflicted by weapons. It was inflicted by compassion. For many, that moment of mercy was the true point of surrender, not when they laid down their rifles, not when the emperor's voice ended the war, but when an American soldier handed them warmth instead of pain. It was in that instant they realized their world of absolutes had collapsed, that victory and virtue had been illusions. The empire had taught them to die bravely, the enemy had taught them to live, and that, somehow, was harder to bear. As they aged, the memories did not fade. The scent of that blanket, the sound of an unfamiliar voice speaking gently through the dark. They returned at night when the world was quiet. Some of them wept again, decades later, not from trauma, but from the knowledge that their tears had once meant the end of everything they believed in. It was mercy, yes, but mercy that stripped them bare. It did not heal them, it changed them forever. The lesson did not come on the battlefield. It did not come with explosions or the thunder of aircraft. It came quietly, in moments so small that no report or diary could ever capture them. The women who had once sworn to die for the emperor learned that defeat did not always bear the face of violence. Sometimes it came wrapped in warmth. Sometimes it came with a hand extended instead of raised. It came when the enemy refused to behave like the monsters they had been warned about. For those women, the realization was not immediate. It settled slowly, like a tide creeping over a beach after the storm. In the American camps, everything functioned by routine, meals on time, rules obeyed, boundaries respected. No hatred, no punishment, no cruelty. It was not compassion that undid them, but the absence of vengeance. The Americans did not need to remind them who had lost. They simply treated them as human beings, and that quiet decency was unbearable. Many years later, when they looked back, they could still recall the first moment that broke them. One remembered watching an American soldier lighting a cigarette and placing it gently between the fingers of a wounded Japanese prisoner who could not move his hands. Another spoke of an army nurse who had a blanket around her shoulders, as if she were a child. These gestures were not meant as kindness. They were habit, procedure, the way Americans cared for their own. But for women, they were a revelation. The enemy's humanity struck harder than any bomb. They began to see that their entire world had been built upon a lie. The lie that mercy was weakness, that surrender was shame, that the enemy was less than human. When that lie fell apart, everything else followed. The doctrines they had memorized in school, the slogans they had whispered like prayers, the blind devotion to men who had sent them to die, all of it crumbled under the weight of a single act of decency. The Americans never intended to teach them anything. They were soldiers performing their duty, not philosophers proving a point. Yet their restraint became its own kind of conquest. They had defeated an empire not by burning its cities alone, but by disproving its faith. The Japanese commanders had believed that their enemy's strength came from brutality. They could not comprehend a victory rooted in order, discipline, and restraint. The women did. They had lived it. In later years, women hid their stories. Japan did not want to hear that the enemy had been kind. It was easier to rebuild around the myth of noble defeat than to face the truth that kindness, not cruelty, had undone them. But the memory endured, carved deep into silence, the warmth of that blanket, the steadiness of that voice saying, "You're safe now." One of the former nurses, when she was old and gray, told a historian that she still remembered the smell of that wool blanket more clearly than her own mother's perfume. "It was the moment I understood," she said. "They had won long before we surrendered. The Americans had not conquered them by force. They had conquered them by contradiction, by proving that humanity could survive war. The women who had been ready to die learned that true defeat was not death at all. It was discovering that the world you killed for had never been real, and that your enemy had shown you the truth, not with the sword, but with mercy.